tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
One of the people who stands out as, and I don't use the word lightly, a hero of the last several years is Dr. Matt Strauss. Now, Dr. Strauss, you've seen on this program before. He's been a tremendous advocate for not COVID denialism, not anti-vaccine rhetoric, of just science and medicine, and of taking a very traditional view of medicine, which is that you should try to personalize it to the patient and not paint entire societies and countries with a one-size-fits-all solution when that may not fit their individual needs. And he's also spoken at great length about the harms, the adverse effects of some of the purported remedies and treatments, such as lockdowns, for example. And it's his COVID skepticism that Dr. Strauss argues jeopardized his role at Queen's University and ultimately led to him being forced out of that role. He has now filed a lawsuit against Queen's. And while we can't talk about this matter because it is before the legal system, I did think it was a good opportunity to talk in general about the retrospective on this last few years and where it all went so wrong from an academic freedom, a medical freedom, and a free speech perspective. So Dr. Matt Strauss joins me now. It's good to talk to you again, Dr. Strauss. Thanks for coming back on the show.
It's always nice to talk to you, Andrew. That introduction was too kind. I'm
well, it was very much deserved, and I say that just to not to toot your horn even more, or maybe I am trying to do that, but I say that because a lot of people didn't realize how much doctors were putting on the line if they did speak out. And I would say there were probably some cases where people didn't realize their own power and they didn't realize that they did have a voice. But there were a lot of times where people said, look, if I speak up, I lose the ability to practice medicine, or they feared that was going to happen. And I was wondering where you sort of land on this now, having seen some of your colleagues and you've seen people go through this process. Do you think that the negative consequences for those who spoke out are over?
Oh, no. Certainly the negative consequences aren't over. And that's not just for physicians. Since I started speaking out about some of my concerns about pandemic management, but especially since, unfortunately, this news of my lawsuit was made public, I've heard from so many Canadians. A real estate agent texted me today to say that she had a hard time being able to speak out. A child psychologist reached out to me, a construction company executive. I've heard from school board trustees. Like it seems to me that throughout Canada, exacerbated during the pandemic, but in all areas of public life, people feel that they can't speak their mind. And my fundamental concern is we're not going to have good public policy if we don't have good public debates about things. So I see in every area that people are still suffering from things that happen to them. And, I think you were speaking about wildfires and climate change before I came on. In some ways, we're suffering from it now. I want to hear from a forestry expert. I want to hear from firefighter experts about what could be better about our wildfire response right now. So no, I don't think this problem has gone away, and I think we all need to keep pushing against it and just speaking out for a free, open, liberal, democratic society where people can speak their mind.
In some cases, there is a reason that we have certain established facts in science. And I'd say in medicine, there are probably certain things that are fairly universal and, certain medical treatments of history that have been lost to history and probably for good reason. So on one hand, we don't want the doctor that's going to come out and say, you know what, I think bloodletting needs to make a comeback or something like that. But at the same time, we also need to have room to discuss and to debate. And when the science isn't clear, to say, well, hang on, what I'm seeing in my patients is this, or what I'm seeing in this study is this. And I'm curious where that, how should you let yourself as a physician be guided in that? Because on one hand, you want to do what's in the best interest of your patients. But on the other hand, if a problem is presenting itself, you don't always have time to go through that, academic discourse and study when you're figuring it out. And I'm talking, of course, about the pandemic. I believe that it provided a sense of urgency for doctors, but what was the proper response to that without, basically belaboring something where urgency was required?
So the practice of medicine needs to be sacrosanct. It needs to be approached with great humility and a lot of caution. And professional bodies do need to govern how medicine is practiced. So if I were going out saying, Andrew Lawton, I think that you should treat your COVID with acupuncture, that would be wrong, because acupuncture doesn't treat COVID, and I'm not your physician. I haven't done a history and a physical on you. We're speaking in public. You're not benefiting from physician-patient confidentiality right now. So I really take very seriously the sorts of recommendations that physicians give to their patients. But that's different than having a concern about public policy. And again, I don't want to get into the facts surrounding the case, but fundamentally it was made clear to me that the problem I was having with the administration was that I criticized the government, and that's very different from practicing medicine. So physicians need to be able to criticize the government. They need to be able to criticize public policy. But I 100% agree that physicians cannot cannot recommend quackery to their patients, and nor should they be making medical recommendations to people who are not their patients in public or otherwise.
The funny thing too about universities, and I don't want to draw a false equivalence between real science and political science, which I studied, but universities pride themselves on being anti-authoritarian in so many other disciplines. They would celebrate a professor who came out with some scathing report that condemned the government's approach on some national security law or something like that. And it's weird that skepticism of academic inquiry and really the purpose of academic inquiry, which in university medicine I think is incredibly important, is completely gone on this. The government says it, ergo we just accept it.
Yeah, I think this is a bit new. I think it was seen prior to COVID around things to do with. I think obviously the Israel and Palestine conflict will be with us forever, but I know that on both sides of that set of issues, professors ran afoul of their administration over the last 10 years. But 100%, this idea of academic freedom being sacrosanct was a foundational principle to universities for hundreds of years. In one meeting that I went to, I brought up Noam Chomsky, who is I think it's fair to say a radical leftist and a very interesting thinker. Was arrested by the government at one point for attending a Vietnam War protest, and as far as I'm aware, his institution stuck with him through thick and thin. And thank goodness, because I certainly don't agree with Chomsky on everything, but he's a profoundly interesting thinker, and I have benefited from hearing his thoughts, and I've come to agree with him about many of the things that he has said since the 60s in that arrest.
One of the problems with governments, and I'm using that in the broadest possible sense of just institutions in general, is that they are fallible, and they know they're fallible in some cases. They don't often admit it. One example that comes to mind is Western University, my alma mater. You went there for med school as well. This is a university that had, I think it was a one of a kind or maybe one of two in the country, which was this academic year putting in place a booster mandate for students, not just a vaccine mandate, but a booster mandate, which was supposed to go into effect in September of, I guess it would have been 2022. And there was a rally held around a year ago at which I spoke, at which you spoke, at which your medical colleague, Dr. Martha Fulford, spoke, and a number of student activists. And Western eventually backed off that. Now, they didn't credit it to the backlash. They just kind of just let it die on the order paper, and then a few months later said it's no longer necessary. But there's a case in which Western said one day the science requires a booster for students, and the next day said the science no longer requires a booster for students. So this deference that was expected of you at Queen's and of people elsewhere is on its face absurd, because how is that deference supposed to factor into a world in which governments will change what they believe the science leads them to?
Yeah, I thank you for bringing up that episode with Western, and I'm biased. I love Western. I'll always love Western. I'm glad they did the right thing in the end, and I was so proud and lucky to be part of that student-led movement. But it is true that whoever was doing the university's press releases at that time, who I'm almost sure was not a scientist, but a communications professional of some sort or another, was claiming that the science was on their side. And science doesn't really take sides. Science is a process of open inquiry and debate and evidence gathering and argument synthesis. So it certainly wasn't the case in that instance that the science was on their side. And I'm glad Dr. Fulford and I were able to draw some attention to that. And I guess I like to think that we had some effect on that ineffective and harmful mandate being withdrawn. I would have liked to have seen maybe a bit of a mea culpa from the university on that point of view, but I still love them.
When you look around at Queens in your situation, and again, I'm very careful. I know you can't talk about too much of the facts of the case. So if I'm asking too much, please let me know and I'll back off. But when you look around and saw the dynamic with your colleagues there, were you just the outspoken one, and everyone else was kind of the same as you were on this, but didn't want to put their neck out, or did you really feel like you were alone in this, and that everyone else was really adopting that line that you were expected to adopt genuinely?
I certainly am not the only one who felt the way that I did. Um, I was the only outspoken one who, to my knowledge, I was the only outspoken one to maybe have a set of views that I had. I had several outspoken colleagues who took maybe some views contrary to mine, and I would have loved to have had a debate with them, either on a podcast or somewhere at the university. It became clear that you were became clear to me at many universities that individuals who were towing the party line were allowed to be outspoken, and people who criticized the party line were not allowed to be outspoken. But throughout all of this, like I said, I've heard from so many Canadians of all walks of life, but many of them were colleagues of mine at the university. And I'm not a political person. I'm not a political organizer. I never thought, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll organize a demonstration, or I'll organize a petition, or something like that. And maybe that was an error of mine. But they had careers. They were doing work that was really important. They also have mortgages and kids and that sort of thing. And it never occurred to me to ask someone to stick their own neck out. I understand that it's a lot to chew off. And one does not want to bite off more than one can chew.
Well, and one of the challenges, I mean, you literally had your, I'd missed this part of your story. And when I read about it in the National Post, you had your belongings shoved into a cardboard box. I mean, one of the most sort of depersoning things that, an employer can do. And you had that done to you. And at the time, if I recall, it had kind of blindsided you in a way, because you weren't even aware there was an issue. Like, you weren't even aware that you had been doing something even purportedly wrong in the university's eyes.
Um, I would rather not speak with great specificity about what I thought and when, and what I perceived and when, because that would be a little bit from the hip, and I guess one wants to be really, really careful about.
Okay, let me take a different approach then on this, which is to ask you how you feel about what happened moving beyond it. I know that's sort of a sappy question that I would, criticize most hard-hitting journalists for asking, but I'll ask you how you feel looking back at it, because I've never seen from you, even when this has been going on, anything resembling bitterness or antipathy to Queens. In fact, I've only ever heard you speak highly about your time in academia, both as a student and as on the admin side.
I guess I have a few things to say about that. One is it was a great privilege. It was the best job I've ever had, getting to teach medical students. And I still practice medicine. It's always a privilege to get to look after folks who are having a hard time, who are ill. So, and to my former colleagues, even the ones who disagreed with me, I honestly have nothing but love. This lawsuit is a dispute with some elements of the administration, but frankly, I received not just from colleagues texts of support, but also from professors in other departments. So a professor of law and a professor of bioethics both reached out to me, way back when all this was happening. So I have so much warmth for the Queen's community that is not at all what this is about. And I wouldn't want it to be framed as me having anything other than warmth for my students and the colleagues and my colleagues, former colleagues, I guess. And the other thing I will say is, everyone had a really bad pandemic. I had a bad pandemic in some ways, but I saw horrible things that happened to my patients, both because of COVID and all the other ways that the pandemic and the pandemic restrictions affected their lives. So I had folks who were between life and death in the ICU for 3 months, who weren't allowed to have their family visit. And it was like Russian novel levels of misery and despair. So I can't even somewhat feel bad about what happened to me. I guess, like in contra, and so I would say that if I'm outspoken about these issues, and if I'm maybe pugilistic in terms of defending this principle of academic freedom, I hope I'm doing it for these more public concerns than what happened to me. Because I'm fine. I have a roof over my head. I have 3 square meals a day, and I have a family that loves me. So I can't complain.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful way to put it. And I actually think it's an incredibly thoughtful way of putting it, because so much of what we've seen of the edicts have come from people that weren't affected by what they were doing. I mean, someone who's married and has a family at home telling someone who lives alone that they have to stay at home alone and can't go see their neighbors. Someone who doesn't have a family member dying in a care home telling other people that they can't go and visit their loved one, their grandma or father or whatever in a care home. So all of these things I would agree were absolutely horrible. And I'm glad you've come through it the way you have. And I wish you well in this lawsuit. Dr. Matt Strauss, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on, Matt.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.